It was supposed to be simple, a modest backyard pool, a place for my kids to laugh, play, and escape the brutal summer heat. I followed every rule, got every permit, checked every box. But the HOA, they said no. Not because it was unsafe, not because it broke any law, but because it didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic. That's when I realized something. They didn't care about rules. They cared about control. So I gave up on the pool and threw a 2-day, 200-kid slip and slide party right on HOA property, right next to the president's house. And best of all, there was nothing they could do to stop it. This is how one denied pool turned into the loudest, wettest, most glorious act of suburban rebellion this neighborhood has ever seen. And yes, it was completely within the rules. Stay with me. You're going to want to hear every soaked, petty, rule-bending detail. It all started in the early days of spring, when the first hints of warmth returned to the air and the icy grasp of winter finally let go. The Johnson family, nestled in a quaint cul-de-sac in a seemingly quiet suburban neighborhood, had finally saved up enough money to embark on a project they had been dreaming about for years, building a backyard pool. For Mike Johnson, a father of 3 energetic kids and a full-time project manager, this pool wasn't just a backyard upgrade. It was a reward, a symbol of family time, relaxation, and relief from the scorching summer heat that always seemed to overstay its welcome. After years of budgeting, planning, and researching contractors, the family was finally ready to break ground. Mike's vision was modest by any luxurious standard, a medium-sized in-ground pool with a shallow end for the kids and a deeper section for diving. A simple stone patio would line the pool's edge, and a small shed nearby would house pool equipment and floaties. It wasn't an extravagant setup, but it was theirs, and to them it was perfect. The Johnsons lived in the Oak Ridge Estates, a neighborhood governed by a particularly strict HOA. While the HOA rules had always been a nuisance, Mike never anticipated that his dream pool would be a battleground. He submitted his construction plans to the HOA in compliance with neighborhood guidelines, accompanied by all necessary permits from the city. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Finally, a letter arrived in a cream-colored envelope bearing the familiar Oak Ridge HOA logo. The content of the letter was both brief and infuriating. The request for a pool was denied due to aesthetic concerns and potential disruption to neighborhood harmony. Mike reread the letter multiple times, searching for logic that wasn't there. The backyard wasn't visible from the street. There was no mention in the bylaws explicitly banning pools. And most of all, other homes in nearby subdivisions had pools, some even grander than what the Johnsons proposed. Confused and frustrated, Mike requested a meeting with the HOA board to clarify the decision. The meeting was held in the local community center and chaired by the HOA president, Linda Cartwright, a woman whose reputation in the neighborhood was ironclad and authoritarian. Mike laid out his case calmly, pointing to the bylaws, city permits, and the private nature of his backyard. But the board was unmoved. Linda, in particular, was rigid. She insisted that the pool would attract unnecessary noise and could lead to gatherings that might disrupt the serene nature of Oak Ridge Estates. She even went as far as to say that once one homeowner builds a pool, others would follow, potentially lowering property values. It was a crushing defeat. Returning home, Mike broke the news to his wife and kids. Disappointment washed over them like cold water. The children had been eagerly looking forward to pool parties and lazy summer afternoons splashing around. Mike felt defeated, but more than that, he felt wronged. His compliance with every rule had counted for nothing, and the arbitrary decision by a small group of people now held dominion over his private property. Over the following weeks, Mike watched the days grow longer and hotter. His kids tried to make do with a garden hose and a kiddie pool, but it wasn't the same. Meanwhile, Linda Cartwright's house, which sat 2 doors down and had a clear view of several backyards including the Johnsons', remained a symbol of rigid control. But as the summer approached and temperatures soared, so did Mike's resolve. He might not be able to build a pool, but that didn't mean his backyard couldn't be transformed into something even more lively. Something that followed every rule in the book but still made a statement. And that's when the idea hit him, sudden, brilliant, and utterly petty. If he couldn't have a pool because it might cause noise and gatherings, why not host the biggest, loudest, most delightfully chaotic backyard water event the neighborhood had ever seen? A slip-and slide party. A colossal one. Mike began to sketch out the plan in secret. He read the HOA bylaws carefully and found no mention of temporary inflatable water toys, yard slides, or non-permanent installations. As long as it wasn't a permanent structure, he was in the clear. And he would make sure that everything he did was meticulously within the rules. The gears were turning. He started by discreetly collecting large tarps, hoses, and biodegradable soap. He contacted a local party supply store and reserved inflatable water toys and bounce houses. He hired a DJ for outdoor music, which was permitted until 8 p.m. under HOA guidelines. He even printed out flyers and distributed them to parents at his kids' school, inviting them to what he dubbed the Great Oak Ridge Water Bash. All he needed now was the right day, the right weather, and one final push to set the plan into motion. The pool was gone, but the party was just beginning. It had been 3 weeks since the crushing letter from the HOA landed in Greg's mailbox. And yet, the sting hadn't faded one bit. Every time he looked out at the patch of dirt and flattened grass where his dream pool was supposed to be, he felt the same gut punch of disappointment. The crushed limestone he had spread to level the area sat useless and dusty. His 2 kids, Ellie and Max, asked about the pool nearly every day, their innocent voices filled with confused hope. Greg didn't have the heart to tell them that the dream had been killed, not by budget, not by weather, but by a group of clipboard warriors enforcing vague rules in the name of neighborhood aesthetics. The HOA had always been a nuisance, but this was personal. Greg had dotted every I, crossed every T, submitted all the required documents, architectural plans, and even hired a landscaping consultant to make sure the pool would integrate perfectly with the existing backyard. He'd gone above and beyond, even meeting with the HOA president, Diane Croft, a woman with an unshakable bun and a permanent scowl. She had smiled coldly and nodded, pretending to listen, then voted no when the time came, citing a clause about maintaining uniform visual harmony in the neighborhood. Uniform visual harmony. That phrase kept echoing in Greg's head like a bad jingle. It was a neighborhood of beige siding, identikit mailboxes, and weekly mowed lawns, where any deviation, be it a colorful door, a hammock in the front yard, or apparently a private pool, was seen as a threat to the social order. The final rejection had come with a veiled warning. Any further non-compliant construction will result in escalating fines and legal action. No room for compromise. No appeal. Just an end to a dream, rubber-stamped and returned in a manila envelope. Greg could have rolled over. That's what the HOA wanted. Most people did. It was easier to comply than to fight. But something inside him had snapped. Maybe it was the disappointment in his kids' eyes. Maybe it was the months of planning and thousands of dollars already spent. Or maybe it was the smug look on Diane Croft's face as she passed by his house the morning after the rejection, slowing just enough for him to notice. That's when Greg knew this wouldn't end quietly. He spent the next week watching videos, reading blogs, and skimming the HOA bylaws like a man possessed. The rules were restrictive but not invincible. There were loopholes, gray areas, and oddly specific clauses that bordered on the absurd. And buried on page 47 of the 62-page document was one particular line that lit a fire in Greg's brain. Temporary recreational water-based fixtures are permitted for up to 48 hours with no formal approval required. There it was, his golden ticket. Temporary. That word was doing a lot of heavy lifting, and Greg planned to exploit it for everything it was worth. That same day, he called his cousin Steve, an ex-carnival worker turned event planner, and pitched him a wild idea. It wasn't just about making a point anymore. It was about sending a message. A wet, wild, legally compliant message that Diane Croft and her crew of rule-happy enforcers couldn't ignore. Steve loved the idea. In fact, he took it and ran. Before long, the concept had evolved from a casual backyard water day into a full-on suburban water park experience. Giant inflatable slides, foam machines, dozens of kiddie pools, a DJ booth, food trucks, water balloons. Greg even found a company that specialized in 100-foot commercial-grade slip and slides. It was absurd. It was loud. It was colorful. And best of all, it was temporary. He planned meticulously. The HOA couldn't fine him if everything was set up and torn down within the 48-hour window. He documented every clause, printed out every permit for the food trucks, kept digital receipts, and created a legal paper trail longer than some murder investigations. He even got the support of several other parents in the neighborhood, many of whom had their own horror stories with the HOA. What began as a personal mission was starting to feel like a suburban rebellion. Then came the invitations. Greg designed colorful flyers and handed them out at school drop-off. Biggest slip and slide party ever. Free for all neighborhood kids. 2 days only. Within hours, the buzz started. Kids chattered excitedly on the bus. Parents whispered at the community center. Rumors spread online that the pool guy who got rejected by the HOA was planning the ultimate comeback. Greg knew he couldn't hold it at his own house. His backyard wasn't big enough for what this had become. But there was one open grassy lot, unused, publicly accessible, and technically HOA-controlled, right next to none other than Diane Croft's property line. The lot had been meant for a future gazebo that never materialized. Now it would become ground zero for the most epic, wettest protest the HOA had ever seen. As the delivery trucks rolled in the night before the event, Greg felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Excitement. The inflatable slides stood like colorful monuments under the setting sun. The long plastic slip and slides stretched across the hill, shimmering with anticipation. Buckets of water balloons were prepped and ready. Generators hummed. Water tanks were filled. Everything was in place. And Diane Croft had no idea what was coming. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the pristine streets and beige homes of the neighborhood. The calm before the storm. The real fun would begin in the morning. The morning of the event arrived with an unseasonable heat wave, as if nature itself had RSVP'd to Greg's slip and slide rebellion. By 8 a.m., the temperature had already climbed past 85 degrees, and parents throughout Oak Ridge estates were reaching for sunscreen and towels, packing water bottles, and coaxing their kids into swimsuits. What had begun as a personal protest had transformed into a community-wide event, and Greg was the accidental hero of the hour. From his vantage point atop the slope of the grassy lot, Greg surveyed the scene with a quiet pride. The massive commercial slip and slide gleamed under the sunlight, pre-soaked and ready to launch kids at thrilling speeds. On one end, the inflatable foam machine churned up clouds of harmless bubbles, while a pair of bounce houses bounced rhythmically under the supervision of 2 hired attendants. The smell of grilled hot dogs and kettle corn wafted from the 2 food trucks stationed near the sidewalk. Upbeat music thumped through the DJ's speakers, punctuated occasionally by the sound of delighted shrieks from children zipping down the hill. It was a perfect spectacle of summer chaos, and every inch of it was legal. At precisely 9 a.m., the first wave of families began to arrive. Parents, initially skeptical, were won over by the enthusiastic shouts of their children and the sight of dozens of kids already racing through sprinklers and launching themselves down the slide. Greg's own kids, Ellie and Max, were at the center of the action. Faces painted, clothes soaked, pure joy radiating from every pore. All the disappointment of the denied pool seemed to evaporate in the haze of sunscreen and laughter. But not everyone was smiling. At 9:47 a.m., right on schedule, Diane Croft appeared. She stepped out of her home wearing her signature visor and HOA-issued name badge, clipboard already tucked under one arm like a sheriff surveying an unruly town. Her expression twisted with every step closer to the commotion. As she reached the edge of the field, just yards from where water balloons were being handed out in bulk, she was already on her phone. Greg spotted her instantly and calmly made his way over. He'd rehearsed this moment in his head a dozen times. As he approached, he gave her a friendly wave and a wide, almost taunting smile. Diane's eyes narrowed. She didn't wave back. She gestured to the towering, inflatable structures. "This is completely out of order," she muttered, even though Greg could barely hear her over the music. "You didn't submit a proposal. There's no prior approval." This violates. Greg pulled out a laminated page, his copy of the bylaws, and pointed with deliberate calm at the highlighted clause about temporary recreational fixtures. It's all within the rules, Diane. Everything will be gone in 48 hours. You're welcome to join us. I hear the foam machine is very therapeutic. For a brief moment, Diane was speechless. Then, visibly flustered, she turned her attention back to her phone, barking into it about noise complaints and rule violations. Greg, having already notified local authorities about the event, knew she'd get nowhere. The police had no issue as long as noise ordinances weren't broken and no roads were blocked. And since the field was HOA common property, with no reserved events scheduled, there was nothing in the book to stop him. As the day wore on, the turnout exceeded even Greg's expectations. Over 200 people, children, teens, and their weary parents, cycled through the event. Families brought coolers, folding chairs, and pop-up tents. Someone brought a portable misting fan. Water balloons rained down in wild, shrieking skirmishes. The inflatable obstacle course turned into a racetrack. A group of kids began a foam fight near the DJ booth. Adults lounged in mini kiddie pools with cold drinks in hand, laughing at the absurdity of it all. Diane's clipboard, once her weapon of enforcement, now looked comically inadequate as she paced the perimeter of the field, taking notes, muttering to herself, and occasionally scolding children who splashed too close to her lawn. And Greg? He leaned back in a lawn chair with a soda in hand, watching the spectacle unfold like a man who had just pulled off the greatest legal prank in suburban history. By mid-afternoon, word had spread to nearby neighborhoods. Teenagers on bikes showed up. Curious grandparents arrived with cameras, snapping photos of the Suburban Water Festival. One mom, holding a toddler in one arm and a popsicle in the other, leaned over to Greg and whispered, "I haven't seen this many happy people in Oak Ridge since the HOA forgot to send the lawn regulation emails last year." The entire event took on a celebratory, almost rebellious energy. It wasn't just about fun anymore, it was about freedom. Families who had been bullied by obscure rules and arbitrary rejections suddenly felt like they had a voice, and that voice was loud, slippery, and soaked in soap and sunshine. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, the DJ lowered the volume, and families started to pack up. Volunteers helped clean stray water balloons and collect trash. The food trucks drove off. The generators were turned down. Greg stood quietly beside the slip and slide, watching the last of the foam dissolve into the grass. Ellie and Max ran up to him, dripping wet and beaming, begging to do it all again tomorrow. He knelt beside them, wrapping them in towels. "You know," he said, "I think we just might." From behind him, he could still feel Diane's gaze burning into his back. But it didn't matter. She had watched the whole thing, helpless, powerless to stop it. And it was only day one. The final cleanup crew arrived with trucks and bins, ready to restore the field to its original state before the HOA could dream up any after-the-fact complaints. Greg's plan had worked to perfection, but he wasn't done. Tomorrow would be even bigger. The next morning dawned even hotter than the first. The heat wave showed no signs of slowing, and neither did Greg's plan. Where day one had been a massive success, day two was poised to become a full-blown spectacle. A final flourish that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind, especially the HOA's, that his rebellion was not only intentional but utterly unstoppable. Greg was up before the sun. As he walked onto the open grassy lot, steam already rising off the damp ground, the field looked like a battle-worn arena. But it would be reborn again today. He had orchestrated the cleanup the night before with military precision. Trash bins emptied, tarps folded, every inflatable deflated and packed neatly away. The lot was spotless, but not for long. By 7:30 a.m., the delivery trucks were back. Only this time they brought more. Double the inflatables. A second slip and slide. This one featuring a giant inflatable crocodile at the end. A foam cannon with an extended range. Greg had even rented a dunk tank and arranged for a local high school mascot to volunteer as the first Dunkey. More food vendors showed up, setting up shaded booths with lemonade, popsicles, and tacos. One parent brought a snow cone machine. Another, a portable karaoke setup. Today would be louder, wetter, wilder. And yet, every element remained squarely within the bounds of the HOA's sacred bylaws. Greg had printed copies of the rules and taped them to each inflatable structure. He posted laminated signs at every entrance reminding attendees to respect noise curfews, clean up after themselves, and be courteous to neighbors. Policies the HOA itself would have written. By 9 a.m., the field was alive again. But unlike day one, there was tension in the air, an underlying current of resistance. Everyone knew what was coming. Greg's act of suburban defiance had stirred the hornet's nest, and the HOA, especially Diane Croft, was bound to respond. And respond they did. At 10:15 a.m., a white SUV with the Oak Ridge HOA emblem pulled up alongside the field. Out stepped Diane, flanked by two board members. Alan, the vice president known for measuring grass lengths with a ruler, and Judith, the secretary infamous for citing leaf blower violations. Diane wasn't holding her clipboard this time. She held a megaphone. She marched straight to the center of the field, foam bubbles clinging to the hem of her linen pants, and raised the megaphone to her mouth. The crowd paused, confused. Kids stopped mid-slide. Parents turned with furrowed brows. Greg, already anticipating the move, stepped forward calmly, hands behind his back. This event, Diane began, her voice amplified and shrill, is in direct violation of the intended use of HOA common property. A murmur rippled through the crowd. She continued, no prior authorization was obtained. No community vote was held. No reservation was submitted. This is not a playground. It is not a fairground. This is a disruption. Greg held up his laminated copy of the bylaws like a priest holding scripture. Page 47, he called out. Temporary recreational fixtures permitted for up to 48 hours. All structures non-permanent. All noise levels compliant. No blocking of roads or driveways. This lot was never reserved, and its intended future use has no construction timeline. I'm well within my rights. Diane ignored him, addressing the parents. You're all in violation. If you don't disperse immediately, fines will be issued to every household in attendance. Gasps followed, but Greg didn't flinch. You can't legally fine anyone without first issuing written warnings and conducting an appeal process, he said. And given that this is HOA property being used by HOA residents in accordance with the current rules, any attempt to do so could be seen as abuse of power. We've documented everything. Photos, videos, witnesses. We're ready. That last sentence hit home. Diane's face blanched. She turned to Alan, who whispered something into her ear. She lowered the megaphone, and then she left. Not in a huff, not in defeat, but in something worse, quiet retreat. It was the first public HOA climb down the neighborhood had ever witnessed. That moment was electric. Parents cheered. Kids screamed and launched into a new water balloon fight. The DJ cranked up the music. Greg stood in the center of it all, soaking wet, sunburnt, and smiling like a man who had just won a war without firing a shot. But the victory, while sweet, was not without cost. That afternoon, HOA board members began canvassing door to door. Not issuing fines, they had no legal standing to do so, but delivering pamphlets with passive-aggressive titles like The Importance of Order and How Community Unity Prevents Chaos. They made vague threats about upcoming changes to the bylaws and hinted at emergency meetings to address recent disruptions. Greg collected the pamphlets like trophies, and still the party raged on. By the end of day 2, the kids were exhausted, parents giddy and sun-drenched. Volunteers helped tear everything down again. Trucks loaded up the inflatables, water tanks were drained, hoses rolled. By nightfall, the lot was once again pristine. Every blade of grass accounted for, every piece of trash removed. No evidence of rebellion, no violation committed. Just smiles, memories, and the echoes of joy bouncing off the walls of a neighborhood used to silence. Greg returned home that night with his kids asleep in the back seat of his SUV, their hair still wet and tangled. His wife, Sarah, stood on the porch, arms crossed, grinning. "You pulled it off," she said, handing him a towel. "Not just yet," Greg replied. "They'll come back harder. They always do." He wasn't wrong. In the days ahead, the HOA would retaliate in ways that tested Greg's patience, creativity, and grit. They would try to rewrite rules, file complaints, even rally neighbors against him. But Greg had something stronger than rules or committees. He had the support of a community that finally found its voice. And he wasn't backing down. The slip-and-slide rebellion had ignited something far more significant than Greg anticipated. What had started as a personal act of defiance had turned into a symbol, a full-on uprising against the overreach of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. For 2 blissful days, the neighborhood had basked in a freedom it hadn't known in years. But that kind of disruption, however joyful, was not going to go unanswered. It began the following Monday, under a facade of order and protocol. At exactly 6:15 a.m., a mass email was sent from the HOA board to all residents of Oak Ridge. The subject line read, "Emergency Amendment Meeting. Attendance strongly encouraged." The message, sterile and corporate in tone, stated that the board would be holding a special session to address unauthorized public use of shared property, improper recreational activity, and future preventative measures. It ended with a sentence in bold red text. Changes may include retroactive penalties. Retroactive. The word hung ominously over the neighborhood like a storm cloud. Greg, ever the planner, wasn't surprised. He had spent the weekend preparing for this exact move. As much as he wanted to believe the battle had been won, he knew better. Bureaucrats never lose quietly. They retreat, regroup, and come back with paperwork. The emergency meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community clubhouse. Greg marked his calendar and began rallying his new allies. Over the last few days, parents had been reaching out, thanking him, praising the event, offering help, and more importantly, sharing their own stories of HOA harassment. Fines for unapproved flower beds. Cease and desist notices for having seasonal wreaths. Threats over minor paint color changes. The grievances were widespread, long-held, and finally boiling to the surface. Greg spent hours compiling them into a presentation. His approach wouldn't be angry, it would be factual, methodical, and devastatingly precise. He wasn't just defending a weekend of water fun. He was putting the HOA itself on trial. By Thursday evening, the clubhouse was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls, and the usually empty meeting room buzzed with quiet unrest. Diane Croft sat at the front table flanked by Alan and Judith, the same clipboard-wielding board members who had tried to shut down the party days before. Diane looked tired, but determined. She tapped her pen against her notebook as if already drafting her countermeasures in her head. Greg sat front row, laptop in hand, waiting. The meeting opened with the usual hollow pleasantries. Then Diane launched into her prepared statement, an unyielding declaration of control wrapped in corporate language. She cited neighborhood unity, safety concerns, potential liabilities, and what she called the slippery slope of unchecked recreation. She proposed a new bylaw amendment that would require prior written approval for any temporary recreational installation on HOA property. No exceptions, regardless of duration or intention. When she finally finished, the room was silent. Then Greg stood up. He walked to the front with measured calm, plugged in his laptop, and projected his presentation onto the clubhouse screen. The title slide read, "The Silent Majority, a Resident's Response." His first few slides displayed photos from the event. Kids laughing, families bonding, neat cleanup crews, not a single piece of trash in sight. Then he presented the HOA bylaws with highlights and annotations, showing exactly how every aspect of the event had followed the rules. Next came testimonies. Dozens of them. Greg read quotes from residents who had lived in fear of HOA retaliation for years. He cited cases of inconsistent enforcement, double standards, and fines issued without due process. One by one, heads in the audience began nodding. Then came the most damning section: comparisons. Greg had researched neighboring HOAs and found that Oak Ridge was not only the strictest in the area but also the least transparent, with no public access to board meeting minutes, no appeals process for fines, and no democratic method for electing new board members. Gasps filled the room. Greg closed with a proposal of his own, a petition to revise the HOA charter. It included the introduction of a formal appeals process, term limits for board members, and a resident committee to oversee future amendments. And then he stepped back. The board was stunned. Diane cleared her throat, trying to regain control. "This is highly irregular," she said. "We appreciate the feedback, but she didn't get to finish." A hand went up in the back of the room. Then another, and another. One by one, residents stood and began to speak. Not in outrage, but in quiet, firm resistance. Stories poured out. Instances of overreach. Encounters with intimidation. People who had lived in fear of minor infractions now spoke with new confidence. The board was surrounded. By the end of the meeting, it was clear. The proposed amendment wouldn't pass without a vote, and the vote was slipping through Diane's fingers. The residents demanded transparency. They demanded representation. They demanded change. Greg left the meeting to a round of applause, but he didn't feel victorious. Not yet. This wasn't about winning a petty feud anymore. It was about restoring a sense of balance to a place that had forgotten its purpose. HOAs were meant to protect neighborhoods, not control them. The days that followed saw an explosion of activity. The petition Greg had circulated gained traction quickly, gathering over 60% of the neighborhood's signatures in under a week. Parents, retirees, and even long-silent residents joined the movement. A few board members began to waver. Alan stopped attending HOA patrols. Judith, cornered by 3 angry residents at the community garden, resigned from her position altogether. Only Diane remained. She was losing control, and she knew it. Greg had never wanted power, but power had come to him not because he sought it, but because the people around him realized they no longer had to be afraid. And as the foundation of the HOA began to crack, Greg knew the final battle was coming. One last meeting, one last confrontation, and it would decide the future of Oak Ridge Estates. The final HOA meeting was unlike any other in the history of Oak Ridge Estates. Word had spread across the community like wildfire. Flyers were tucked under doormats. Emails buzzed through inboxes. Even elderly residents who typically stayed out of neighborhood politics were talking about it at the community mailbox. Everyone knew what was at stake. 4 years, the HOA had operated like an unseen hand, firm, unquestionable, and absolute. But now, for the first time, its grip was slipping. At precisely 6 p.m. on a warm Friday evening, residents began filing into the clubhouse. It was standing room only. The crowd spilled out into the hallway, with some people even propping the doors open so they could listen from the sidewalk. Tension hung in the air, heavy and electric. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a referendum. At the front of the room, Diane Croft sat with her usual poise, visibly composed but unmistakably on edge. Her tightly drawn bun seemed even more severe than usual. Her white blouse was pristine, her clipboard at the ready. But unlike before, she no longer radiated confidence. There was a tremble in the way she tapped her pen. The power she once held with impunity was now being challenged, and the fortress she had built with bylaws and bureaucracy had begun to crumble around her. Greg arrived early. He didn't wear anything flashy, just jeans and a polo, the uniform of a suburban dad who happened to lead a movement. He carried no megaphone, no dramatic banners. Just a manila folder filled with paperwork and the strength of 200 voices behind him. The meeting was called to order, but no one listened. The residents had already decided what would be discussed. Greg stepped forward, folder in hand. In his calm, steady voice, he laid it all out once more. The community had petitioned for change. The signatures were valid. The grievances were documented. The HOA had failed in its duty to serve, not rule, its residents. What followed wasn't a tirade, but a simple demand. A democratic election for the HOA board, complete with term limits, transparent bylaws, and a new oversight committee comprised of volunteers from within the neighborhood. The room thundered in applause. Diane tried to speak, but each attempt was drowned out by a wave of public commentary. Residents who had never dared to speak at meetings before stood up, one after another, voicing their frustrations, recounting the petty citations, the absurd fines, the silencing of dissent. The stories were emotional, personal. Some were infuriating. Others were heartbreaking. Then came the final blow. A retired attorney named Marla, a quiet woman who had lived in Oak Ridge for 22 years, stood from the back and held up a printed packet. She had reviewed the HOA's bylaws, state homeowner association statutes, and even court rulings regarding HOA overreach. Her findings were devastating. What Diane and her board had done for years, issuing citations without due process, denying reasonable property improvements, ignoring appeals, was not only improper. In many cases, it was legally questionable. The room fell into an uneasy silence as Marla detailed each example. Diane didn't speak. She just sat there, her eyes fixed straight ahead, lips tight, clipboard limp in her hands. When the floor was opened for final statements, Greg spoke one last time. He wasn't angry. He didn't gloat. He simply thanked everyone for showing up, for caring, for standing together, and for remembering that a neighborhood is not meant to be governed by fear. It is meant to be lived in, celebrated, enjoyed. When the vote was finally cast to restructure the HOA and remove the current board, it passed with an overwhelming majority. Diane didn't stay for the final tally. She left in the middle of the count, slipping out the side door with only a few loyalists trailing behind her. Just like that, the reign of Oak Ridge's most notorious bureaucrat came to an end. In the weeks that followed, changes swept through the neighborhood like a fresh breeze. The new board, led by a rotating group of residents, including Greg, Marla, and a few other volunteers, drafted a revised charter. Fines could now be appealed. Communication became transparent and open. Rules were reviewed and stripped of their vague language. Instead of enforcement patrols, there were now monthly neighborhood gatherings, potlucks, gardening clubs, and yes, recreation events. Greg didn't stay on the board for long, just long enough to see the foundation reset and the tone restored. He wasn't interested in power. He had made his point. And as for the infamous pool, 6 months later, after the bylaw review was complete and community feedback had been collected, the new board voted to approve backyard pools under clear, reasonable guidelines. Greg built his the following spring. It wasn't the biggest pool, or the flashiest, but it was his, paid for in sweat, frustration, and 2 days of glorious suburban water war. On the day it opened, Ellie and Max were the first to jump in, splashing, shrieking, and laughing with a joy that echoed across the backyard and beyond. Neighbors dropped by with towels, lemonade, and wide grins. Kids raced around. Adults chatted in the shade. And somewhere, Greg knew, Diane Croft sat in her beige home, blinds drawn, listening to the sound of summer drifting over her fence like poetic justice. What started as a rejected pool permit had become a movement, a shift in power, a reminder that even in the most rigid of neighborhoods, the spirit of community and a little bit of petty creativity could bring real change. The HOA hadn't just been challenged. It had been redefined. And all it took was a slip and slide.